Thank you, John, and thanks for being here this Saturday. Thanks for the introduction and the chance to be with you to speak about Carlo Acutis in Eucharistic miracles. I want to dedicate this lecture before I begin to the memory of my colleague, Greg Hillis, who died from cancer in October of 2024. So let's just take a moment remembering Greg. Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him. May he rest in peace. Amen. The temptation to normalize sanctity, I think, comes from a good place. Relatable saints can be imitated. We have a desire to open up whatever the Catholic version of Us Weekly's stars, they're just like us, and see St. Francis of Assisi watering his garden while suffering from stigmata. St. Ignatius of Loyola is just your average bro who wanted people to find God in all things. He just happened to break out in tears every time he celebrated Mass. Or St. Catherine of Siena, she's a fine example of a woman leader in the Roman Catholic Church who exerted power against corruption. We'll bracket out that she survived exclusively on eating the Eucharist for years. The closer the saint is to our day, the more we wipe out the weirdness of sanctity. Blessed, soon-to-be Saint Carlo Acutis, is especially prone to this kind of treatment. When his canonization was announced, newspapers declared the first millennial saint, because to old people, millennials are still young. Sorry, everyone. I'm a technical millennial. All right. Statues of Carlo depict him wearing tennis shoes or sneakers. He has a video recorder or a computer in his arms. He's dressed as Italian teenagers from the early aughts might have dressed. He was a web designer. He had a video game system, just like I did. Who is more relatable than Blessed Carlo? Hashtag millennial saints. Which incidentally proves I'm a millennial because I just used a way of doing things from Twitter, which people don't use. Carlo died in 2006 from leukemia. He was 15. As it turns out, like the other saints of the Catholic Church, his normalcy is, well, relative. Carlo asked to receive his first communion at the age of 6, before the rest of his classmates. From then on, he was a daily communicant. My son, who is 11, and my daughter, who will receive her first communion, attend Mass reluctantly on a weekly basis. I attend Mass reluctantly on a weekly basis. Carlo lived an ascetic life. Yes, he had a video game system, but he played the system for an hour per week at most. As a 42-year-old man, I continue to play video games for a longer time per week than Carlo did when he was 15. Especially when I bought the new NCAA college football game. Yeah. Let's go Irish. According to me, we're going to beat Florida State by many points today. If Carlo was given anything, a bike, clothing, or a pair of new shoes, he gave it away to the poor immediately. His family was well off, but almost anything he received, he sought to pass on to the homeless in Milan. His funeral mass was full of people who were recipients of Carlo's hidden acts of charity. No one, including his parents, knew he was doing it. Yes, before he died, Carlo made websites, but not the kind of websites that young people tend to make today. He was not anticipating the arrival of cryptocurrency. He was not making a ride-sharing app, nor for that matter was he even engaged in what we would call influencer-based Catholic evangelization. He focused on those dimensions of Catholicism that, well, are uncomfortable to many of us modern Westerners. Marian apparitions, Eucharistic miracles. The kind of interruptions of the supernatural into the mundane that many theology departments, not our own, but others, do their best to avoid speaking about, except as religious phenomena that expose the zeitgeist of an era. He thought the internet could be a different kind of place, one that led people to visit Eucharistic and Marian shrines, but he was mostly wary of the internet, especially the free license it gave to pornography. When he died, his mother, Antonia Salzano, found herself reading the various diaries that Carlo kept on his computer. What she discovered was not a teenager developing a small business plan with a potential move to Silicon Valley. Instead, it was a diary full of theological insights, especially around the Eucharist, from a 15-year-old boy who seemed to possess the kind of insight that only the mystic saints have. During the terrible suffering he endured in the 11 days between his diagnosis and his death, he did not complain. I complain all the time. Not about death, but just traffic. Even in South Bend. So during the terrible suffering, right, he offered his suffering for Pope Benedict XVI and the entire Catholic Church. And through his life and death, he transformed the existence of his mother, Antonio, who went from being a religiously apathetic Catholic to a devout one who studied for a master's degree in theology. So those of you who are studying for master's degrees, welcome. Now I ask you, the attendee of the lecture, to think back and remember what you were doing when you were 15. Lest you feel uncomfortable admitting it, at the age of 15, I was not begging to attend daily Mass. I was not thinking about Eucharistic miracles or Marian apparitions, though there were some young women named Mary who occupied much of my attention. I was playing video games, mostly Mortal Kombat, listening to Weezer or the presidents of the United States of America. I was certainly not setting up websites related to Eucharistic miracles. In fairness, I didn't have the internet until I was 18. But when I did get it, I mostly set up an instant messenger account to talk to friends about nothing, right? And to leave vaguely unclear away messages to people I wanted to date to see if they would understand where I was. And then maybe they would come, and then they had a crush on me, and then it never worked. Okay, so I certainly, at the age of 15, couldn't imagine offering my terminal diagnosis for anyone, let alone the Pope. Carlo was, well, weird. This clue to unlocking his holiness, I want to suggest, is related to the websites he set up. Marian apparitions, Eucharistic miracles. He believed and then lived out the consequences of the incarnation. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, lived among us, died among us, rose for us, and still is here for us. He is present on every altar in every hungry and thirsty person who directs their gaze to us, asking for a cup of cold water. And if you want to pursue holiness, then it's through that materiality, from the Eucharistic body and blood of Christ to the flesh and blood life we possess here and now. The body matters because Christ's body matters. That's at least the story I want to tell you today. But first, we have to start with that devotion that Carlo possessed toward the Eucharist itself. Miracles related to the Eucharist are manifold. But the first and primary Eucharistic miracle is, well, the Eucharist itself. At every Mass, bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. Through the words that he spoke at the Last Supper, through the power of the Spirit, bread and wine become the true presence of the Lord. In the early church, the focus of Eucharistic transformation was the miracle of a food that leads us into immortality, inviting us to share in divine life. You may see bread and wine, St. Cyril of Jerusalem says, but your senses fail you. When you receive the Eucharist, he describes in his 5th mystagogical sermon, don't come and grasp the elements. Approach them with reverence. Make of your hands a throne to receive Christ's body. Having received Christ, sanctify your eyes and your lips. Then receive the wine, which is Christ's blood. Sanctify each of your senses, every one of the senses, through the blood, the moisture that is on your lips. This patristic approach to the Eucharist eventually proved insufficient. The story is a long one involving the introduction of a philosophical schema distinct from the modified Platonism of early Christianity, eventual heresies that doubted the presence of Christ, and a new relationship to the Eucharist arising what we would today call popular piety. The Eucharist was no longer miraculous food alone. The Eucharist became the personal presence of the Lord. Even when you didn't receive the Eucharist, and most medievals didn't, at least often in their lives, that even when you didn't receive it, your eyes are sanctified through the sense of sight in ocular communion. Your eyes, through sight, touch the host. If the Eucharist is processed through town, taken to the sick, then everyone kneels before the presence. The Eucharist must be something more than sanctified food. Out of this, we get some of the earliest accounts of Eucharistic miracles. The paradigmatic one is the Mass of St. Gregory the Great. We have a testimony to this already in the 8th and 9th centuries. The type of miracle is basically established. Mass is being celebrated, but someone doubts that the Eucharist is truly the presence of Christ. Sometimes in this saintly legend, it's the woman who baked the bread for Mass. In other legends, it's the deacon, in other accounts. St. Gregory the Great asks for a sign, and the Eucharist becomes a bleeding finger, or in later accounts of the legend, the man of sorrows, he appears. The purpose of the miracle is to lead to a conversion in belief on the part of the one who doubts. Before moving to some of the other miracle stories that I will tell you today, it's important to tend a bit to the Eucharistic theology that does arise from the late medieval period. As I've already said, the Eucharist is a miracle, but how? Miracles tend to be understood as a sign or wonder connected to divine power. They tend to lead to the control of nature through an extraordinary act of this power. We've heard about this throughout this year's lecture series. Saints who fly, saints who bleed, saints whose very body heals what were thought to be life-ending diseases. Such miracles are exceptions, at least to our eyes, to how the material world normally functions. People don't normally fly. I haven't seen it today. We don't normally bleed from our hands inside without also dying. And my body has never healed anyone yet. Okay. The transformation of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ isn't that kind of miracle. For what the church eventually calls transubstantiation is not a natural change, but a supernatural one. In 1215, before Thomas Aquinas was even born, the Fourth Lateran Council noted that the transformation of the Eucharistic elements could be described as transubstantiation. But the council, like lots of church councils, did not examine every theological nicety about this. It was up to St. Thomas Aquinas, among others, to attend to the miraculous quality of transubstantiation. The transformation of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ at the level of substance is beyond miracle. Right? It is the act of Christ whose words at the Last Supper were authoritative. The invisible substance, what makes bread and wine what they are, is transformed at the words of Christ, spoken by the priest in his very person. This is my body. This is my blood. We're not talking about a physical change, but as Thomas invites us to sing in the Adoro te Devote, and in this translation by Gerard Manley Hopkins, seeing, touching, tasting, are in thee deceived. How, says trusty hearing, that shall be believed. What God's Son has told me, take for truth I do. Truth himself speaks truly, or there's nothing true. Still, there remains a pesky problem. for something whose substance is changed. The body and blood of Christ continue to act a lot like bread and wine. The host is broken, the blood of Christ is poured, and the blood still intoxicates. Here, at last, we have what might be properly called the miracle of the Eucharist. The Eucharistic substance is transformed without the accidents or species changing. St. Thomas is showing, in fact, how unlike Aristotle he is, for Aristotle's substances don't do this. They don't change their substance and yet contain and still look and act the same way. It would be like me saying to you, and you would probably lock me up, hey, listen, you see before you a human being named Tim. But guess what? I'm not Tim. I'm not a human. I'm a bear. Sure, your senses say to you that this is a middle-aged professor, Tim, the human being, but your senses are wrong. I'm a bear of roughly 7 years of age. Right? You would lock me up. The Eucharistic miracle is the personal presence of Christ. His body and blood for the life of the world shared with us under the material signs of bread and wine. It's no magic trick or deception of the senses, right? Unlike Tim the bear, right? Christ gives himself to us in a way that we can receive him as food and drink. The species where the accidents remain, they're sustained without a substance. That's the miracle. And they are sustained in this way so that Christ can be with us as manna from heaven, food for the journey, making us co-participants in the ecclesial banquet that anticipates heaven itself. Christ does not depart heaven to do this, as Thomas clarifies. Jesus isn't trapped in the host, right? Hi. But this piece of matter is taken up entirely into God without losing what makes it act and behave like matter. Transubstantiation, as it turns out, anticipates what creation itself will become when Christ will be all in all. Still then, what about Eucharistic miracles? When the host begins to bleed, when Jesus appears on the altar and everyone sees him, aren't those miracles just lifting the veil for us? Helping us see what's really happening in transubstantiation? It's the proof that we're looking for. For Thomas, no. Although relatively silent on Eucharistic miracles, devoting one article of a single question, in the Summa, the third part, question 77, article 8, he speaks about these Eucharistic miracles as a secondary one. Means that it's possible, right? It's a secondary one. The miracle of transubstantiation, the sustaining of accidents without a substance, means it's possible for the Eucharist to have yet another miraculous transformation. The accidents can become blood. The accidents might have the appearance of Christ. But once the accidents are no longer bread or wine, then we're not speaking about the Eucharist anymore, per se. We now possess a relic of a Eucharistic miracle. The question then becomes, if the Eucharist is already the personal presence of the Lord of heaven and earth, why do we need Eucharistic miracles? Isn't Mass enough? Well, first off, yes. The Eucharistic worship of the Church is enough. In the catalog entitled The Eucharistic Miracles of the World, a catechesis precedes the whole thing, introducing it. It says the following: we must never forget nor fail to mention that the Eucharist is the true, great, inexhaustible daily miracle. If the human family appreciated this fact, then Eucharistic miracles would be of little interest to us, since we would have learned to see the glorious presence of the Lord given in sacramental form. A bleeding host compares little to the gift bestowed at your parish altar every day. But the reality, as Carlo knew, is that we don't appreciate this fact. And the Eucharistic Lord wants human beings to recognize the gift of this presence, the wondrous fact that the Word became flesh, dwelt among us, and is present to us under these sacramental signs. Carlo's own Eucharistic thought, his mystical appreciation of the mystery, is the key to understanding what's happening in these miracles for our own age. In a book written by his mother, My Son Carlo, Carlo Acutis Through the Eyes of His Mother, right? A sort of reverse of Augustine, right? Augustine writes about Monica. Monica writes about Carlo. Antonio Cassano Acutis shares large portions of these theological notes he wrote on his computer with the reader. The longest sections are on the Eucharist, the sacrament that Carlo called the highway to heaven. From Carlo himself, and this is a longer quote. And so the Eucharist, which is a second incarnation, truly becomes not so much a sacrament in the ritual sense, but a sacrament in the supernatural sense. For this reason, when we take communion, Jesus pauses among us for 15 minutes, hidden in the form of bread and wine, substantially present, truly residing. Again, 15-year-old Tim did not know that. He shares the day with us and continues after the forms of bread and wine have decomposed, with his grace, his residence with us. So we become his house, his home. And so Jesus, present, alive, and real, is not only a fact of faith, not only a fact of sacramentality, but a fact of life. Jesus is with me and I with him as an extremely personal, individual fact. This direct contact between Jesus and I occurs to the Eucharist in the faith. When Jesus came to this planet Earth, okay, his Christology needs some work, but we'll work on that. When Jesus came to the planet Earth, he tried to summarize, or as Paul says, to recapitulate all eternity after him. This is residing, and Jesus residing in this sense. Jesus residing in this sense recapitulated in himself, day by day, hour by hour, the entire human race in every sense. And so we have before us a miracle which leaves us in awe and which leaves us truly surprised. It's the miracle of redemption. Pay attention. It's the miracle of redemption. It's the miracle of Jesus' life with us, who, in recapitulating all of humanity in himself, made himself truly, really Redeemer and Sanctifier and Savior of each and every one of us. The miracle of the Eucharist for Carlo is the wondrous mystery of redemption where God became one of us. The heart of secularization for Carlo is both the church and society's forgetfulness of this fact. Love itself came to pitch its tent among us. We're not talking about a nice little ritual, a pleasant series of aesthetic rites that make us feel God's presence. God is here in the smallest, most poor, unknown parish church because the God-man dwells on that altar, in tabernacles and in the human heart. Our lives cannot be understood as human beings apart from the materiality of God's self-emptying love in Christ given in the Eucharist. It was this materiality was really why Carlo was so interested in both Eucharistic miracles and Marian apparitions. These interventions in human history are the extension of the fact of redemption here and now. You want to turn Christianity into a series of moral principles, right? How about intellectual proposals separated from the person of Christ, right? Because at the heart of Catholicism is, really a principle of sacramentality, right? Of incarnationalism. Fanciful tales, right? Once upon a time, there was this Jesus, and he was in the Gospels, and if we hear about him today, our hearts may lift, right? You can't make these moves for Carlo. You find yourself tripping over the materiality of it all, the very fact that God became man to save you, each one of us. On the altar, the beauty of Christ's redemptive gift is given to us if only we possess the eyes to see. Now, I want to return to some of those Eucharistic miracles, looking at them anew. Right? Although there are lots of different types of Eucharistic miracles, and if we had many hours, we could look at them, I want to look just at a couple of these miracles, ones specifically where the host does something miraculous. It bleeds. It can't be lifted off the ground. So, many of these miracles, right, were designed for belief. Someone didn't believe in the true presence, so the host begins to believe, and then they have belief. They might have stolen the Eucharist, right? And the host bleeds, and then they bring the host back and say, Christ is truly here. I should not steal the host. They stole it for bad reasons, like an amulet. They wanted to use it as magic. They stole the host for good reasons too, and this is one I want to focus on. In 1194, a pious woman took the Eucharist home with her because there weren't yet tabernacles in the church. And this is in Austria. She wanted to reserve the Eucharist in the cupboard of her home so that she might express her devotion to the Lord. And this practice was common, actually, in early Christianity, where you would take the sanctified food home with you and have it in your cupboard, and you might even consume it during the week in between, before daily Mass became a phenomenon. By the way, note, Notre Dame professor is not encouraging you to do this today. Right? 5 years later, she was racked with guilt and brought the host back to the priest. Rather than discover a moldy host, right? I mean, think about it, 5 years there. The Eucharist at this stage was regularly refreshed even when reserved because the materiality molds. He didn't discover that. He discovered that the host was bleeding. At once, the priest told his bishop, and then the town gathered in procession to the cathedral to adore the Eucharistic relic. They didn't put it on a website, right? Or announce it on Twitter, or take a photo of it. They did a procession. Actually, the host continued to bleed, and it bled from Easter and grew until the feast of St. John the Baptist, at which point a feast was established in honor of the relic, and now further Eucharistic miracles have occurred around this, and there's still a procession there today. Now, you could read this miracle as a kind of chiding of a pious woman for transgressing Eucharistic norms, but you don't have to. Her faith led her to want to be close to the Lord. And rather than discovering that she had let the presence of Christ mold, the host bled. Blood in the medieval imagination is the privileged way of expressing love, the love that Christ has. A bleeding host is a sign that invites us to see what the Eucharist is. Christ loves us. And in the end, the woman got exactly what she wanted. There was now a chapel set up that included a Eucharistic relic of Christ's love available for her constant worship. You can see this divine kindness often in these miracles. In Bettbrunn, Germany, the owner of a farm lived far away from the church, an hour and a half. He loved the Blessed Sacrament, and for this reason, he stole a host. He transformed his walking stick into a monstrance. It was like he created a little hole for a monstrance, creating an opening on top where he placed the Eucharistic Lord. He'd position his stick in the ground while tending his flock, then kneel before the presence of Christ. But once he forgot that his stick had a new sanctified use, and he threw it at his wandering flock. Right, the sheep were moving, and he's like, no! And then he was like, no! Okay. Right? He once knew what he had done, and he ran over to try to pick up the host, but it could not be lifted. The parish priest was called in, could not lift the host. The bishop could not lift the host until, right, through some sort of miraculous intervention, the bishop was told that he had to build a chapel on that very site in the middle of the farmer's farm, that it was a chapel for the adoration of the Lord. The miracle was not a punishment, as it turns out, for the man's transgression, but an act of mercy. You can't make it to Mass, but you want to? Guess what? Here's a chapel for you. Sincerely, your Eucharistic Lord. Even in those moments where there is judgment, it's always suffused with mercy. A priest is called to visit a sick man. This one is in Italy. He's sloppy about the whole thing. He places a host haphazardly in between the pages of his breviary to give this man communion, perhaps his last communion. Rather than recognize the significance of his priestly responsibilities, his role in giving communion to this ill man, he treats the whole thing as a job. Get there, get back, and move on, right? My book can hold the host. But when he opens the breviary to give the host, the pages are stuck. The host is bleeding. Yes, he's committed sacrilege against the Eucharist, but he also against his flock. He at once expressed penitence, and his confessor told him that he should keep these pages the rest of his life. It isn't said, but these pages are to serve as a sign for the rest of the days of what it means to be a priest. You treated your sacramental ministry like a duty, but remember when you bestowed men and women the merciful love of God in this sacrament, redemption is at hand. No matter the Eucharistic miracle, what you find in this exhibition, and this in fact is the exhibition that was assembled by Carlo, online now, and now it's a book, and it was certainly at the Eucharistic Congress in Indianapolis. You could see what he has set up himself and now has passed on. If you look at each of these, right, there's an outpouring of divine mercy and redemption. While most of the miracles in this exhibition, this book now, are medieval, they contain several that are contemporary. In both Argentina and Poland, there have been Eucharistic miracles in the late 20th and 21st century where the hosts have bled. Unlike the medieval miracles, these modern ones have been investigated by medical officials. In both cases, the host has been recognized, or the blood is identified as human blood. In both of these cases, in Buenos Aires and in Poland, the blood cells seem to be from a heart that has suffered trauma. The miracle cannot be explained. Hosts have bled, and the relics of these bleeding hosts now attract the devotion of the faithful. The presence of medical investigations around these miracles are really both gift and curse. It's a gift because whatever has happened in this host, we cannot say that it's natural. Something marvelous has unfolded, worth our attention. The danger, though, of the medical data is that we forget miracles are signs. A certain scientific materialism takes over. At last, we have proof of transubstantiation. You as listener know that's not true because you've listened to me for the last 30 minutes. You know that transubstantiation is not a physical change. But such a scientific attitude toward miracles, especially in a polemical context, can be used in the kind of apologetics that forget the reason for the miracle in the first place. We might say to an evangelical Protestant or a lapsed Catholic, "See, you got it wrong. You were wrong all along. He's there. Now you know that we were right from the beginning." Miracles are certainly invitations to believe, but they're not instruments for bludgeoning our neighbor. The medical examination, the recognition that the blood is that of a heart, points us to the medieval and early modern devotion of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. It's no accident that Pope Francis, as Cardinal Bergoglio, was responsible for investigating and approving the Eucharistic miracle in Buenos Aires. He will also likely be the pontiff canonizing Carlo in April. God willing. In his recent encyclical on the Sacred Heart, Pope Francis concludes the first chapter with the following paragraph, which can help us remember the significance of bleeding hosts that have the cellular structure of a bleeding, wounded heart. In the end, the Sacred Heart is the unifying principle of all reality, since Christ is the heart of the world, and the paschal mystery of his death and resurrection is the center of history, which because of him is a history of salvation. All creatures are moving forward with us and through us towards a common point of arrival, which is God. In that transcendent fullness where the risen Christ embraces and illuminates all things. In the presence of the heart of Jesus, I once more ask the Lord to have mercy on this suffering world in which he chose to dwell as one of us. May he pour out the treasures of his light and love so that our world, which presses forward despite wars, socioeconomic disparities, and uses of technology that threaten our humanity, may regain the most important and necessary thing of all, its heart. In these modern Eucharistic miracles, maybe the Lord isn't asking us to be attentive, or is asking us, rather, he is to be attentive to the suffering of this world, to the places where divine mercy is absent. Christ is the center of human history, and everything we're tempted to put in its place will lead to a world devoid of love, to a heartless world. The 20th and 21st centuries are histories of us doing exactly that, replacing mercy and love with totalitarian power, might, and a cool indifference to the suffering of those on the margins, the unborn who bleeds, the migrant who bleeds. the prisoner who bleeds, and the elderly who bleeds and dies alone. The Eucharist bleeds today, inviting us to remember that the ultimate protagonist of history is the one who was born for us, lived for us, died for us, was raised for us, and still loves us. Every time we go to Mass, we receive him anew. The merciful love of God is available to us, not as an abstract idea or an ideology, but in his person. And it is a merciful love given to us so that we might offer this mercy anew to make that love the heart of our reality. Conclusion. All of this brings us back to Carlo, that soon-to-be saint who had a love of this reality. He saw in Eucharistic miracles an invitation for each person to see the world differently, to let a revolution of tenderness unfold in the heart of every recipient of this love. He didn't stop at the miracles, employing them as debate points in online apologetics about true presence. He presented them as icons of Christ's merciful love, of the presence of redemption available to us on every altar and every parish church. The miracles are catalysts for Eucharistic amazement. Most of us won't ever see bleeding or luminous hosts in our lifetime. But that doesn't mean that redemption is any less real, does it? It doesn't mean that we can't behold this redemption in the normal way that the church celebrates each day. Lord, I am not worthy to receive you, but only say the word, and my soul shall be healed. It's always dangerous to do so, but in contemplating these Eucharistic miracles through the eyes of Carlos, I want to offer a subtle addition, or maybe even a correction, to the angelic doctor, St. Thomas, on these miracles. Yes, miracles aren't proof of transubstantiation, but the miracles might be more closely related to this doctrine than we imagine. Joseph Ratzinger, in his own account of transubstantiation, gives a personalist one. In the transformation of the elements in the Eucharist, bread and wine no longer exist as self-subsistent entities. They've become entirely taken up into God's being without losing their creaturely status. They exist not for themselves, but in Christ. Christ has bound himself to this material mediation upon the altar, not trapped in the host, but he gives himself through this transfigured matter that must be broken, given, and poured out. At times, through God's power, is it really surprising that this transfigured matter behaves precisely like the body of Christ? Sometimes bleeding, sometimes luminous, sometimes healing and saving us from tsunamis, as one Eucharistic miracle in Colombia describes. These Eucharistic miracles uncover for us who tend to forget that matter matters in our salvation. God entered into time and space and never left us behind. Yes, he ascended to the right hand of the Father, and there he intercedes for us mortal creatures as the God-man. This very weekend, we dedicated a new reliquary chapel at the Basilica of the Sacred Heart, made possible through the generosity of Tim and Mary Sullivan. The early church treated these relics actually with the same devotion that we give to the Blessed Sacrament. Polycarp's death is described as bread baking, incense ascending into heaven. This is because Polycarp's whole being has been taken up into Christ. His death has become an extension of Christ's self-giving at the Last Supper and Christ's death upon the cross. His relics now are luminous signs that death does not have the last word, that Polycarp is present to us when we pause before the relics. If you visit the basilica and that chapel, yes, they're reminders of virtuous people, but they're more than that. They are the living, efficacious, sacramental signs of the flesh and blood nature of sanctity. The church is real, Christ is real, and you can see it if you want to go over to the basilica after this. In the end, Carlo's weirdness was that. He recognized this fact: God is real, Jesus is real, my life is real, you only have this life. And if you're like Carlo or Greg, it might not be as long as you thought. And if I'm really to live in a way that matters, I must let my substance become Christ's. I must be transubstantiated into him. And when we face the hour of our death, even as we suffer from the kind of cancer that Carlo did, we can pierce through the veil of tears and see that the heart of it all is love. The penultimate words of this lecture belong to Carlo's mother, Antonia, who was taught to recognize that indeed our lives have been given to us so that we might become entirely God's. She learned this through the witness of her son, who was more saint than Sigma, more mystic than meme. Carlo taught me to direct my everyday life toward the seeking of the absolute, of grace. To do this, one must constantly tap into the sacraments, go look for them, attend them. Living while looking towards the absolute helps us to see that every instant of our life is full of an unimaginable light. And in this way, everything is transformed, everything becomes new. The light inhabits our lives, even in unremarkable or dark times. Everything turns in the direction of eternity. Holy Carlo, pray for us. Thanks.